Well, welcome to the Unstuck Church podcast. I'm Sean, your host, here with my teammate, Amy Anderson. And Amy Anderson that is freshly back from the first church we have ever served in the state of Maine.
That's right.
Which we've almost hit all 50 states at this point. But Amy, you got to serve a church in Maine.
I did. And it was great. Maine is a lot like Minnesota, except you know this about me. You know I bring the rain most places I go.
Of course.
So no kidding. I land and it rained the entire time I was there. And then the morning I left, the sun came out and blue skies. But they had been in a drought since June or July, so they were very grateful. Actually, it's been an adventure zone on the road for me, Sean. Not only did I bring the rain to Maine, but I was in Texas working with a great church down there, and I got a flat tire in the left lane of the Texas 121 expressway. I really thought I was going to die. And somehow there was an exit ramp in the 10 seconds it took me to go left lane. By the way, they don't drive like 50 in Texas. They drive 85. That's why I thought I was going to drive. And then I drifted down the exit ramp. I can't believe there was an exit ramp, and across the street into a car repair shop. So God took care of me that day. I was just in North Carolina with another great church. They're a large church that's getting ready to go multi-site. And there I very confidently leaned against a yellow wall that they were painting. And so I was in a black shirt, so the yellow didn't stand out at all. And then my hair actually got stuck in the wall too. So I'm just saying that, consulting, traveling, it's very glamorous and really fun.
Most people assume that this is a very glamorous role, but it's not. Just
it's
FYI.
It's not. But I'm so glad that I'm able to get on site with churches across the country. They always make me better. It's so fun to share what I'm learning at other churches and sharing that. And this is the stuff that feeds the podcast and the things we talk about. So we have a few states left that we've never been. We've never been to, Alaska. New Hampshire.
Alaska.
Yep. Hawaii.
Hawaii is one of the states on our list, but we are going in the new year to work with a great multi-site church in Honolulu. So we will be there in 2026.
So we only have like 3 left. Can we do anything special if one of our listeners is like from New Hampshire and they want to bring us in? Can we like send them a crumble cookie or something like that?
We'll figure something out. Absolutely. Yeah. Sean at theunstuckgroup.com, SEAN at theunstuckgroup.com. Just reach out. Really excited about being able to partner with that church in Hawaii, and just so great to continue on this mission.
We actually just had a church from Hawaii join our executive pastor cohort, or what? No,
that's
a multi-site cohort.
Paris,
and they have 9 locations in Hawaii. Super fun to see what they're doing.
It is, yeah. I love that. All right. Well, before we jump into the content, let's pause real quick and say thanks to our podcast sponsor, Donorbox. I'm sure church leaders and pastors have noticed that less and less people are actually carrying cash to church and giving with cash. But Donorbox has a great solution called their Live Kiosk that helps people actually give instantly at your church. They can tap, swipe, and use their phone to donate, and then you can automatically capture their contact information, send them the needed tax receipts, and even set up reoccurring gifts. Donorbox is actually already helping over 100,000 organizations, and you can try Live Kiosk for free if you go to donorbox.org/unstuckpodcast. That's donorbox.org/unstuckpodcast. Well, Amy, we're in our final episode today in our series on growing church problems. Over the last few weeks, we've been tackling, I think, some pretty real challenges that churches face when they're experiencing growth. Way back in the first episode, we talked about making wise decisions about service times and facilities before you get boxed in. Then, after that, we discussed what do you do when your structure has outgrown your staff. And then last week, we talked about how to scale systems so that key aspects of your church's ministry aren't dependent on just 1 or 2 people. Today, we're going to wrap up the conversation with some time discussing multi-site specifically. Where does multi-site fit into the way that you plan to address growth challenges, either for the first time or ongoing?
Well, this has been a really practical series. I think every church faces growth challenges at some point. And how multi-site fits into this is that, it's one thing to be growing 10, 15% a year, but when you start to run out of space, if you don't have your kind of expansion plan, your replication, like if you're already
Hmm.
optimizing those hours in the morning, it can be a frustrating
Yeah.
season to get behind because there's no quick fixes to fix it. So that's why I wanted to
Yeah.
talk about it today.
Yeah, that's good. Well, let's start with the tensions that churches face when they're thinking about multi-site. For churches that are still one site,
Mhm.
what challenges do they typically encounter that might push them towards that multi-site strategy?
Yeah, I think there's several key tensions we see regularly. One, when churches don't start planning for a second campus soon enough,
Hmm.
they end up accepting like soft growth because they're simply out of space, right? The
Yeah, right.
facility becomes that limiting factor. And in high growth times, I think churches, one of the tensions is they fall behind on their staffing plan.
Hmm.
And because of that, they start hiring these part-time people who are great people, but they're doing things to plug holes. And
Mm.
that actually then leads to a lag in leadership development, right?
Hmm.
Growing up leaders, in a sense, is a common thing I see. Growing up leaders just has not kept pace with your growth. So staff are busy, some are burning out. And when that happens, you can't even consider adding another service because they don't want to, the leaders don't want to exhaust their team even
Right.
further.
Yeah.
And then I think the third thing that comes to mind in this is that there's this growing sense that they could reach more people in their community if they had another location. But the timing and the energy to take that on is just, it's hard in the whirlwind of just keeping up with the growth that God is continuously bringing to your church, right?
Yeah.
There's not a pause button. We still have Sunday coming every week.
Absolutely. What about churches that are already multi-site? They face a different set of tensions when they're considering whether to continue expanding and adding more locations, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a common view that we get to see as we work with churches that are what we call multi-stuck locations. These
Hmm.
are churches with 3 to 4 locations, and often they just hit this point where they are wondering if it's feasible to continue to expand with their current multi-site model.
Yeah.
Meaning, when you're a smaller multi-site church, again 2 to 4 locations somewhere in there, you can get really creative when it comes to running ministry, when it comes to launching locations. Like you
Hmm.
can rotate a team of 5 or 6 teachers to cover live teaching.
Hmm.
It's hard at times, but you can do it. Or
Yeah.
you can keep ministry teams centralized and then break out on the weekend to cover the ministry. But if you want to expand past that 3 or 4 number, here are the tensions that set in. First, because of the model, how you're doing ministry, you've had to overstaff because maybe you got creative in how we're going to cover these 2, 3, 4 locations. And now you feel like you don't really have the financial capacity for future expansion, which
Hmm.
again is super frustrating when you need other locations because your current ones are nearing capacity, at or
Yeah.
nearing capacity. But again, we can overstaff in those smaller phases, but then that becomes that limiting factor. Some churches end up with more locations than makes sense for their size, I think is another tension due to mergers and acquisitions. So we say this a lot when we talk about multi-site, but you asked what's the tension when you
Hmm.
feel like you want to multiply again, but then you feel like you don't know if you can keep expanding. That's when these churches, right? They're actually more locations than they ought to be right now.
Right.
And
Yeah.
most of the time that's because they took on mergers or acquisitions. And
Hmm.
it's just not always wise to accept free property or merger proposals just because the opportunity presents itself. What
Right.
I see is when churches end up with several smaller locations versus fewer larger locations, they actually miss the efficiencies of multi-site because it
Hmm.
requires more staff and more staff because we have to staff for at least the minimal brand viability right
Yeah.
in these places.
Yep.
We have to have a campus pastor, kids pastors, worship production. And what I just mentioned, they can serve a room that has 2,000 seats or they can serve a room that has 80 seats. It's
Hmm.
the same investment. So
Hmm.
it requires more staff. And then, of course, it requires more budget dollars for things like repairs, maintenance, facility upkeep.
Yep. Yep.
And if you're doing live teaching at all locations in this context, this only like expedites the stress on
Hmm.
budget because you have to hire more staff now to do what the CP would be doing. but they are tied up in message prep. So now I know for some churches in your context, in your mission field, smaller is the way to go. And if that's you, you just have to remember that there's a cost to it. And you need to find other ways to reduce costs so that you can sustain smaller locations. And you'll just have to get creative in some areas.
Yeah.
Lastly, and I think this is true, but there can sometimes be internal pressure. So let's say we're a church of 3 or 4 locations, right? I think there can be this internal pressure from both current congregants and staff to focus on strengthening what's already been built rather than launching something new. That could be fatigue in ministry execution, if you are feeling burnt out, too stretched. Sometimes it's fatigue from a giving standpoint, or just a drift in from like a mission mindset to, hey, what about me mindset in the church. So those are probably the top 3 that I see.
Yep, that's true. And that mindset is usually what we see lead to the maintenance phase, to churches just starting to maintain, right?
Yep,
Rather than being in that sustained health phase where they're always asking God, what do you have for us next?
That's right.
Amy, I'm curious then, what solutions have you seen work well for churches that are trying to figure out their multi-site strategy and, they're continuing to allow room for growth?
Yeah. Well, first, churches need to bring clarity to whether they're going to, multi-site or church plant, or if they plan to do some at both points, because these are different strategies with different models and approaches. So for us, multi-site means you're extending your church's ministry model, your culture, and your leadership to new locations. Church planting means you're launching independent churches that may share your DNA initially, but we know it's going to develop into their own identity, and we want that. And I just think being clear about which path you're taking helps you make the subsequent decisions. It helps make that just much easier.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about churches that have decided on multi-site, but they just aren't sure how to approach it strategically?
Yeah, well, this is where I encourage leaders to think bigger and longer term. So if you're a single site church and you're thinking multi site, but you don't know how to approach it, first, don't just think about your second campus, right? Think about campus number 6 or 7. What would it have to look like then? Because this will help you build a sustainable model from the beginning. Just an example, we saw a church that started with live teaching at their second campus. So it was their first multi-site launch. They wanted to do multi-site, not church planting. And boy, within, I think it was the first 18 months, they figured out, boy, if we try to do multi-site this way, it's not going to scale beyond 3 to 4 locations. So they actually brought the lead pastor to the multi-site location where the campus pastor had been teaching. I think he preached there for 4 weeks just to envision the congregation. Said, "Hey, we're gonna do video now, and I just want you to give it a try for 6 months, see what you think." And anyways, they've been running that play, and they were able to clean it up really early in that model. So if you're a single site, you really need to think through how every ministry decision will that play out when we're a church of 5, 6, 7 locations. The second thing I would say is just get ahead of your multi-site plans by get a spreadsheet. I love a good spreadsheet, and take your current attendance and growth and just play it out over time. If we keep growing at, what is it, 10%, 15%, 20%, whatever it is, when will we need to have a multi-site ready to launch? Because if growth's not there, you can always pause, right? But at least you're prepared. I think doing this math will give you a heads up, and when you need to start planning, just like it would for your next service time, it'll help you plan for your next location, because a good launch requires time. You need a minimum, wouldn't you say, Sean, of 12 months to get ready for a multi-site launch? And really more like 18 to 24 months for most churches. And then if you have to actually build a building versus leasing or remodeling, you'll need to add on more time. And I'm just telling you, as your church grows, you're not going to get more time. So when you're in a season where you're growing, but you have room for people, start to play that growth forward so you know when you need to begin your multi-site planning.
That's right. Yeah, I usually tell churches, if you're going multi-site for the first time and you already know who your campus pastor is, so you've already nailed that role, and you already know your location and facility, you've already got that figured out, then 12 months might be the right timeline for you. But the number of churches who know both of those things and are confident in them is very, very small. So
It
18
is.
to 24 months is a much more feasible timeline.
Mm-hmm.
What about some practical next steps that you'd recommend for church leaders who are just considering multi-site for the first time as a response to here's all this growth that's happening around us?
Yeah. Well, as I said, start by getting really clear on whether you want to be a multi site church or not. From Unstuck's perspective, a multi site church is one that is truly one church in multiple
Hmm.
locations. So you're trying to reach a common mission field, right? So that ministry strategies are effective at each location. You're launching where people are already driving from because
Yep.
it's people that carry your culture. They serve, they give, they invite. And you have one teaching team that teaches via video from the broadcast location,
Hmm.
because remember, it's the people who talk the most that actually drive the culture.
Yeah.
So if that's what you want to do, that's one church, multiple locations. If these things are not true, then church planting might be a better approach. For instance, if you're in the suburbs right now, wherever your church is, and you're reaching young families, then don't launch into an urban setting that is mostly Gen Z and college. That's a
Hmm.
different mission field. That's not
Hmm.
what's right for multi-site. If you have 400 people driving to your church from the east and nobody driving in from the west, maybe due to like a geographical situation like a mountain, a river, a freeway, but you feel God calling you to put a church there, then make it a plant. Because again, if
Yeah.
you don't have anyone currently driving from there to your church, you've got a culture, what would I call it? Not vacancy, abyss, black hole. You
Yeah.
don't have anyone to
Yeah.
transfer your culture. But if God is really calling you there, then make it a plant, not a multi
Hmm.
site.
Hmm.
And if you feel called to launch locations with their own live teaching, then plant a church. You can
Hmm.
leverage, obviously, some multi site strategies to support the plant, but design it to be its own thing long
Hmm.
term. Second, if you're a church that's growing and you're in the midst of this, you're running out of space. Um, I hate to say it, it's not easy, but you're going to need to straddle the work that needs to be done right now to make room and start your planning for the future. In fact,
Yeah.
I'm working with a church right now, and that is where they started when they engaged Unstuck. Their first tension was really to manage staffing. Again, rapidly growing single site church, and they were grossly understaffed in leadership when we started
Hmm.
working with them. And their attendee to staff ratio was somewhere around like 135 to 1, which is great if they have all these systems and leadership development going, and but no, it was just literally they didn't have enough people on their team.
Yeah.
And by the way, it took them about a year to make progress on the staffing side of things. But at the same time, they were finishing up a 200 seat venue remodel that kind of serves as another option for the weekend to because their optimal times were full, so it
Hmm.
released the pressure valve. And they're on plan to build a 1,500 seat auditorium. And unfortunately, that's going to take longer than they have time for. So they are actively looking for an offsite venue to fill the gap. And so again,
Mm.
it's hard, which is why I encourage churches to map out potential growth over the years so they can
Yeah.
avoid really this confluence of activity when we fall behind in this area.
Yeah, that's so good. And I think just you bringing that awareness for church leaders is so important. Another example of this is a great church we work with in North Carolina.
Hmm.
October 5th, they started their first multi-site, their first campus. So they
Hmm.
have two locations now. Launched this new location, great grand opening. They sent 300 or 400 people out to this new location.
Hmm.
And I talked to the pastor the week after, and he said, it's like nobody left. He said those 300 or 400 seats just filled right back in the next weekend.
That's
And
right.
what a great problem to have, but they are still straddling both of those issues, trying to create space at the sending campus and then having started this new location where they've got several hundred new people attending.
Hmm.
It is a dual, if you think about two sides of the train track,
Hmm.
you're working both sides of those train tracks at the same time and trying to
Hmm.
continue to make progress. So in a growing church, you need to be prepared for that.
Hmm.
I think also, Amy, what about, the churches that already have multiple locations are already multi-site, but then they're just questioning their strategy moving forward. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I think I would just, call out some of the key multi-site best practices there. Just remember, location actually trumps a facility. You want to choose strategic locations, even if the facilities aren't perfect.
Yeah.
You want to find a location that people drive to, not from, like from
Hmm.
neighborhoods. So think about your location strategy. Are we putting these new locations in good locations across, our city.
Right.
The second one that I call out is just remember leaders more important than location. So do not launch your next location without the right campus pastor. We often say this is the most critical hire when it comes to launching a new location well.
Mm-hmm.
And then third, I mentioned it, but really approach merger opportunities with caution. If you're already a multi-site church and God's doing things through your church and you're growing, for churches that are dying or not on mission, you're going to get the phone call. You're going to get the phone call at some point. And you just have to remember, just because the phone rings doesn't mean it's a sign from God.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is, but we encourage churches to approach it as a dating relationship, not a marriage. So as
Mm-hmm.
you're dating, do the work to see if this is really a win-win for the kingdom, because bad mergers can be a huge distraction from your healthy ministry.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we can't underscore enough how difficult mergers are. It's not that they can't work and can't be healthy long term, but they're really hard. I just talked with a church yesterday, Amy, who went through a merger a couple of years ago and added a location through that. So this was a multi-site church that added a location through a merger. And they talked about some of the challenges they ran into. They ended up having to close that location down. And you could still, a couple of years after, see the disappointment in their faces from that. So,
well, and Sean, if you launch your first multi-site through a merger and it has that outcome, right? We just didn't do enough homework. We didn't treat it like an acquisition, and it doesn't go well. When you try to cast vision around multi-site again, you've got some baggage now. So it's
That's
really
right.
important that first multi-site is a win. And again, there are proven ways to do that really well. And sometimes mergers work, but not always.
Well, Amy, this has been, I think, a lot of really practical, helpful thought around multi-site strategy for churches today. So appreciate that. Before we wrap up this episode and this series, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway is that growth always brings complexity, but with intentional planning, you can create, sustainable paths forward. So whether you choose to go multi-site or not, the key is making proactive decisions about your future rather than just reacting to growth pressures. And remember, the goal isn't just to get bigger, but to reach more people with the hope of Jesus.
Right.
So consider your unique community context and think through what strategy is going to serve it best. We would caution you to copy another church's model without understanding the principles behind why it actually works for them, and be willing to adapt as you learn on what works and what doesn't. I do want to end, Sean, with just a few comments on live versus video teaching. If you are a single site church right now considering multi-site, this is especially for you. Our data shows that multi-site churches that eventually closed campuses were 4 times more likely to have used a model where the campus pastor was the primary teacher. Churches that we're working with that have live teaching in 2 to 4 locations are dealing with the reality right now that they can't multiply that strategy, and they're just going through the painful work of bringing alignment to their locations. In other words, this decision is hard to undo once live teaching has been the norm. And just remember, video works. We say it all the time. It works everywhere across the country. Well, great teaching on video works really well.
That's right.
Poor teaching on video doesn't work well. But for those who are leaning into this episode, maybe because you're thinking about going multi-site, that's just probably the thing I want to end with today, is make sure you get that aspect of how we're going to do the teaching right, because it'll affect where you go 3-4 years from now.
Yeah, that's good coaching, Amy. Very good. Well, of course, multi-site can be an excellent way to continue to make room for growth, but there are definitely new muscles for churches to build as they do this. And of course, that's where we come in. We help pastors lead unstuck churches, and we have 2 specific processes for multi-site churches. The multi-site launch process, where we help you go from monosite, just one site, to multi-site for the very first time. And then what we call our multi-site unstuck process, where you help you clarify your strategies and structure for continued expansion into the future. You can learn about how both of those work and start a conversation with us today at theunstuckgroup.com. Next week, we're back with a brand new series. It's going to be a good one. I won't tell you yet what it is, just because I want to let you wonder. But we hope we see you then.